Today I'm going to talk about some aspects of meditation. In particular, I want to try and somewhat clarify and discuss the differences and functions of the two principal kinds of meditation, samatha and vipassana. There are in the Theravada tradition and in Buddhism in general, there are many kinds of meditation, many traditions, many particular practices, but we can generally categorize all these forms of meditation into either samatha or vipassana. Samatha meditation is meditation that is based on attempting to unify the mind on a single object. There is a wide range of objects that can be used for this purpose. Kasina meditation, which is meditation on a physical object as a visual basis. A mantra, which is a verbal recitation. Meditation on the Brahma-viharas, the states of loving kindness and compassion and so forth, is also classed as samatha meditation. Most common, most basic in our tradition is meditation on the breath, anapanasati, which means mindfulness directed towards the in and out breath. This form of meditation takes the physical sensation of breathing as the basis, as the object. So it has the single sense base of the sense of touch, the tactile sense, which is used, and the mind attempts to come to unity on that object. This kind of meditation principally develops the mental quality of Samadhi, which is defined as stability of mind. It's literally non-wavering in the formal definition. So the ordinary mind, the mind that we experience in our day-to-day activities, is not still and it's not unified. It's jumping from sense base to sense base, seeing, hearing, thinking, smelling, tasting, and from object to object. And it's necessary that we do this in order to function. That's how we get along in the world. But when we take up the meditation, we're doing something different than our ordinary mode of consciousness. We're trying to settle the mind, calm the mind, and unify the mind. We don't want to be flitting from object to object. So that we're making the effort in samatha meditation to stay still on the single object. And this form of meditation reaches a state of culmination in the jhanas, which are states of mind in which the consciousness is not at all moving from object to object, but is stable, completely still, unified on a single object. The other form of meditation is Vipassana meditation, which means clear seeing. And it's generally considered to be more difficult. And here again we have many different particular ways of doing it. I think I should make this point at the outset. This is sometimes a point of confusion. People learn a method of Vipassana and they think this is Vipassana. The method is not the Vipassana. The Vipassana is essentially a state of mind. It's a way of holding the mind. And there are different ways of accessing this, and particularly in the Burmese tradition, has been very rich in developing methodologies of Vipassana. And in Western countries, two of these in particular have become popularized, but in Burma there are dozens. The ones that people might know from experience are the Goenka tradition and the Mahasi tradition. And they're both Vipassana traditions, but they have quite different methodologies. Just briefly, the Goenka method is based on body scanning. The meditator scans the body for sensations and settles on particular sensations in the body to focus on. Mahasi tradition is sometimes called the noting practice. It's based on the mind, to begin with, is settled on the abdomen, the moving of the breath up and down in the belly. And then when anything else arises to mind, like a thought or a sense impression or a sensation in the body elsewhere, you make a mental note of it, like feeling, hearing, imagining. And there are other techniques than these, but these are the two that people here might have encountered. These are methods of accessing the state of mind, which is Vipassana. Vipassana is sometimes called choiceless awareness. And this is having the mind focus intently on whatever object is presented to it for an instant. And it's a difficult skill to master. It's like any skill, or you might say a knack. It's something you have to find by practice. And there are two components to it, both equally important. One is you're striving not to miss anything. Whatever arises to consciousness is seen clearly. And on the other hand, you're striving not to hold on to anything. That everything which arises is treated exactly the same. Nothing is too trivial to miss, and nothing is so important it must be held. Everything is just allowed to pass through, clearly seen and pass through. Sometimes people use the phrase letting go, and I think even that's a little bit misleading, because letting go implies that you have held it and then you let go. You should be striving not even to hold it in the first place. Just let it pass through. And eventually, if this meditation is done properly and consistently, then the feeling tone should become equanimous. There's quite a literature which you can look at, for those that are interested, by various writers, mostly Burmese, that go into detail about the stages the mind goes through in acquiring skill in Vipassana. But what it culminates in is a state of mind called equanimity about formations, which is, you might say, Vipassana being done perfectly, where it doesn't even feel like you're making any effort. It doesn't feel like you're meditating, but it's just happening perfectly. And it's equanimous because the mind is not moved. It's not upset. It's not either frightened or passionate. And it doesn't take particular interest in any object. It's all just an object of consciousness. Now, these two kinds of meditation, samatha and vipassana, are both components of a well-developed practice, and they both have their functions and their purpose. And there's commonly a question comes up, how much samatha should I do? How much vipassana should I do? How should I combine them, mix them? And there's no real definitive answer to that. I can make a few kind of general observations. One is that if we go back to the original suttas, the Buddha in different places, occasionally he talked about various paths of practice culminating in full awakening. And there's a few variations, but the most common path he talks about is practice into the jhanas and going through all four jhanas and then taking emergence from the jhana as an object of insight. So doing Vipassana only after mastering the jhanas and then taking that the rest of the way. On the other extreme, we have what's sometimes called the bare insight path, which again is a particularly Burmese development, which says don't bother with doing samatha meditation, it's just a waste of time, just do Vipassana. Because Vipassana is the crown jewel, Vipassana is what eventually leads to awakening, and life is short, just do Vipassana. The bare insight path is not without a traditional basis. It is briefly mentioned in one or two places without being described in the suttas. But I think as a matter of practical experience, for almost everybody, that's a very difficult path to go. To speak from my own personal history, when I first started practicing, the first retreats I did were under Kema Ananda, who at that time, later he modified his teachings, but at that time when I started with him, he was teaching very traditional, strict Mahasi Sayadaw or Burmese style meditation retreats. And I don't know nowadays if you can even find one of those, anybody doing those in North America anymore. The practice was you had a group of people meditating together, and you would do it for 2 weeks, 20 hours a day, sitting and walking. And there were 4 hours allowed for sleep, and the meal time, there was also a meditation practice to do during the meal. And the idea was to have no break whatsoever in the practice. And there was no preparation, no samatha. Generally, the way we did it was the teacher would give a talk the night before, and we'd all go to bed, and then the bell would ring at 4 in the morning, and you start. And you keep going, alternating walking, sitting an hour each for 20 hours, then you lie down and sleep for 4 hours, and then the bell rings again, and you're up again. I can say this was extremely difficult, and we had a very high dropout rate. A lot of people would not finish the 2 weeks. I remember one fellow actually running down the road. It was a powerful. If you stuck with it, you got good results. But Vipassana is by nature difficult, and it's more difficult if you just jump into it cold. If the mind is prepared by doing samatha, which is what the Buddha generally would recommend, then the samatha becomes easier. And it makes sense. You're trying to examine the contents of the consciousness stream. And if you just, come in from a busy life and all sorts of issues unresolved and all sorts of history and emotional baggage, and you just come in off the street, so to speak, and just start, okay, I want to watch every content of consciousness. It's really painful. It's almost like dragging yourself across broken bricks and bottles. But if you calm the mind first, so the mind is peaceful, and then it's easier to examine. And the stuff still comes up that you've got to deal with the content, but you've got space. It's not just a constant barrage of one thing after another. You have space, so it's very useful and important to settle the mind first. In many places, if you go to do a formal Vipassana retreat, and I know this is the Goenka tradition, they do 10-day retreats, and they do the first 3 days on mindfulness of breathing before they take up the Vipassana. And many places you go, they'll if you're doing like a structured formal retreat, they'll start you with some samatha first, and I think that's generally the wisest course. And as to the question of how much samatha you need before you take up Vipassana, there's no real fixed answer to that. In Thailand, many of the Thai ajahns, like Ajahn Chah, they would somewhat de-emphasize the difference between samatha and Vipassana, and sometimes Ajahn Chah's method is called the natural method, and he preferred to use words that are translated into English as more like wisdom and samadhi, wisdom being the Vipassana practice and samadhi being the samatha practice. And the idea is you do samatha or develop samadhi until you reach a point where you kind of plateaued, however much samadhi you're able to get at this time. And then you take that calm, clarified mind and you do Vipassana. And you do Vipassana until you grow weary, because it is a difficult practice and the mind will get weary and begin to fray at the edges and you're not practicing as well as you could. Then you go back to samatha to refresh the mind and build it, and hopefully every time, every cycle, you deepen both practices. And one of Ajahn Chah's sayings was that wisdom builds samadhi, samadhi builds wisdom. There are some observations I'd like to make about various approaches, attitudes I've seen in people over the years. One thing that I think is a kind of a common failing of Western people is that we're impatient. We want it all, we want it right now. So a lot of Westerners, they hear about, samatha doesn't take you all the way, Vipassana is the only thing that can get you actually awakened. They say, well, why bother with samatha? Just jump right into Vipassana. And they don't want to fool around with they want to jump in the deep end before they can dog paddle. And I've seen a problem that arises with people who have followed one or the other of the Vipassana traditions for years, and then they try to pick up samatha later, and they find it difficult because the way of holding the objects is quite different, and they've been training not to miss anything, to be fully conscious of each object which arises, which is proper Vipassana. And then with samatha practice, it's quite otherwise. You're trying to unify the mind on a single object. And the proper practice at that time is to disregard everything else which arises. And to learn that it's a totally different set of skills. It's a different skill. It's a skill of non-attention, disregarding. So people are trying to develop samatha, and then something arises in the mind that seems to them important. Maybe it's like an idea or an old memory or something. Oh, I got to look at this. And then they go off. They're not doing samatha. They've lost their thread. With samatha meditation, you're trying to cultivate the attitude that only the chosen object, which is ultimately is arbitrarily chosen. So you sit down and say, I'm going to watch the breath. You choose that as the object. Then whatever else arises is static, and it's not to be attended to. It's to be disregarded. Whereas in Vipassana, there is no static. You're doing Vipassana right, there is no distractions. There's just a variety of objects. Whatever object arises is seen and allowed to pass through. Just as the Vipassana method of investigation can be corrupting to jhana, the jhana-like experiences can be disruptive of developing Vipassana. And in this case, the literature I spoke about, talking about the stages of insight, is quite explicit about this. There's a phenomena that's called the 10 corruptions of insight. That someone's developing Vipassana, they reach a certain degree of clarity in the mind. They've gotten over the initial difficulties and they're practicing, and then they begin to have jhana-like experiences. They begin to feel very peaceful. Sometimes they see a bright light. They might feel sensations like they're floating. They feel joy and enthusiasm. And they're all very pleasant. And they're classed as corruptions of insight. If they arose in the jhana path, they would be signs that the mind is getting deeper samadhi, and they would be very good. But if they develop while doing insight, it's a sign that the mind has reached a certain stage. They wouldn't occur if you hadn't been practicing well to that point. But they become corruptions if you become attached to them and seek to immerse in them and find them pleasant and want to kind of abide there. Then the meditation is stalled, you don't go any further. And some individuals, particularly if they don't have any teaching or any theoretical background, they can actually mistake this stage of the path for enlightenment, for awakening. That's been known to happen. But it's just a stage, it's just a phase the mind's going through, and if you're rigorous with your noticing, so if things arise like pleasant sensations in the body, feelings of floating, you just notice that as an object. It's just another object of awareness. And don't attach any importance to it. Don't make any big fuss about it. Just carry on. You'll pass through that fairly quickly. And this is called discerning what is path and what is not path. And some teachers will say that you're only really doing Vipassana after you get through that and you reach the stage of what is path and what is not path. Developing a samatha meditation has many benefits. It's always useful and to be encouraged that one spends some time developing it. One of the benefits spoken of by the Buddha was it's a pleasant abiding here and now. It just feels good when you got it on. Just pleasant. It's like a holiday, an escape from the turmoil of the mind. The mind is peaceful. It also has the advantage, if you get deeper into samadhi and begin to touch on the jhana states, you're touching on a different level of consciousness. So it has the advantage of simplifying samsara by shedding temporarily a whole layer. And this is really quite important to understand. Our ordinary consciousness in the human form, our ordinary consciousness is sense desire plane, kama bhumi, which means that our experience is mediated through the senses. Our feelings, our emotions, our desires, our fears all relate to sense objects. And it's very noisy in the sense desire realm. It's constant clamoring of different sense objects, sense desires, and sense fears and revulsions constantly impinging on the mind. When you get to the experience of jhana, then that's all dropped away. You're no longer in the kama bhumi, you're now in the rupa bhumi, the plane of form. And here you have shed a whole layer, a whole chunk of complication, and the mind is simplified to a more primordial kind of a state. And here the desires are not for sense objects. The desires are simplified down to the desire for existence and the desire for non-existence. And these are actually much deeper, more fundamental desires than the sense desires. But the sense desires are noisy at our level, at our ordinary level, so we don't see these more fundamental issues. But if you simplify the mind to that state where the senses become irrelevant, then you see things in a different way. And this can simplify and clarify the approach to full liberation. The importance of developing these samatha meditations is something that the Buddha spoke about often. And in fact, the word in Pali, the word most commonly used that's translated as to meditate is jayati, which means to do jhana. So when the Buddha is talking about meditating, he's usually talking about doing jhana. So in a sense, you could say, as a way of speaking, that you're not really doing vipassana until you've got to the stage of what is path and what is not path. You're not really doing samatha until you're at least in the initial stages of jhana. Meditation means doing jhana. Then if you take this kind of clarified mind, and it's compared by the Buddha to working gold, as one of his analogies. It's like if you dig out a chunk of gold ore, you can't do much with it. It's brittle, it's hard, it's not workable. But if you heat it and purify it and beat it and work it and refine it, you get pure gold. It's very malleable. Gold is very flexible. You can make shapes out of it. You can beat it very thin. You can do all sorts of things with it. So one of the qualities of the mind that has good samadhi is it's malleable. You can work with it. It's not brittle. It's not difficult. It's not heavy and cumbersome. It's light and malleable. So you take that into Vipassana and you begin this rigorous practice of noticing objects and not being attached to anything, not holding on to anything, just letting objects pass through. And eventually you come to this place of equanimity about formations, which is really the true Vipassana. And this is not yet the end. It's not full awakening, but it could be called the jumping off place, because the realization of nibbana, or awakening, can only happen from that mind state. Once you reach that mind state, there's nothing more you can do. You can't force it any further. You just have to sit there and let the mind do its thing. So that's as far as you can go by striving. And then you're there and you just wait. The Suddhimagga has a quite evocative image. It says that the mind in equanimity about formations is like a ship at sea. And in the olden times, they would have a bird they called the land-finding crow. They kept a crow in a cage on the ship. And when they thought they might be close to land, they would release the crow and watch which way he went. And first he'd fly off to the north, say, and then eventually, if he didn't see any land, he'd come back to the ship. And they'd let him rest a bit, then they'd release him again, and he'd fly off to the east. And if he didn't find land, he'd come back, and so on. And eventually, he wouldn't come back, and they'd know there's land in that direction. And it said that the mind in equanimity about formations is every now and again it's like the crow. It goes off looking for the far shore. And a lot of times it doesn't find it. It goes back to the ship. But eventually it doesn't come back. So to summarize the important points, these two forms of meditation are both very useful. Balanced practice will work with both. different ways of holding the mind. Vipassana is the more difficult one, and it's the one that's actually the gateway to liberation. But it's made much easier if the meditator has a good basis in samatha practice. And samatha practice by itself has its own rewards.